This audio presentation of Hi Dad is brought to you by the Supreme Council of the Scottish Rite, Southern Jurisdiction. Written by Herbert Ewing Duncan. Executive producers: Scottish Rite Grand Commander James D. Cole, 33rd degree. Grand Master of DeMolay John Sellars, and DeMolay Grand Secretary Stephen E. Crane. Narrated and produced by Matt Bowers, 32nd degree. Consulting producer Dean Alban, 33rd degree. Hi Dad Book, copyright 1981. Audio recordings copyright 2023. All rights reserved. For information on how you can donate to support this audio serial, visit DeMolay.org. Chapter 10. New Frontiers. The quiet years of DeMolay were also the quiet years for the nation, as America slowly drew itself from the Depression with federal help to employment, agriculture, and business. People in all walks of life seemed oblivious to the forces that were gaining strength in other parts of the world. America was isolationist. It had taken a vital, triumphant part in one world war and wanted only to work on its own destiny in peace, to dodge the present and future problems and, if possible, recreate the nostalgia of an agrarian society. It was a dangerous position. Hitler's coming to power in Germany had taken place to revive the menace of a new world war. Mussolini in Italy had gained such power as to invade Ethiopia in 1935. Tyranny had come to Spain under General Franco, and in 1931 Japan launched her first attacks on China. Neville Chamberlain's appeasement visit to Munich was followed by the German invasion of Poland. Stalin launched his invasion of Finland late in November 1939. President Roosevelt cautioned the nation that, when peace is broken anywhere, the peace of all countries everywhere is in danger. No nation, no fraternal organization can live in a world of changing action without that action casting its shadow over its own activities. Frank Land was keenly aware of the turmoil that was to shake the world into World War II and call for American participation. He knew that DeMolay should be constantly aware of social attitudes and the activities of the time and should add programs if necessary or change old procedures if such changes would be in keeping with the thinking of the youth. He said, "The Order of DeMolay has no standardized or set program. Each year or period creates its particular problems affecting youth, and DeMolay assumes that its program must be flexible and easy of adaptation to the times." Mother Preceptory of the Legion of Honor had just completed the service of investiture in 1935 when Clarence Barnacle approached Dad Land with a question that had puzzled him for some time. "You know, Dad," he said, "I have taken part in each investiture of the Mother Group of the Legion since it was formed. At that time, I was about 25, as were the others. 5 years later, the candidates were all my age of 30. Then 5 years later, the cast and those receiving the award were all 35. How about the younger men? There must be some who have just become senior DeMolays that are eligible. Or, if the Legion of Honor is for those who are older, why not form a similar honor for those who are younger?" You are right, Clarence. The age level of those receiving the Legion of Honor has risen as we recognize those who were DeMolays and during the years have shown promise of reaching success in their vocations. The age level will probably grow older as you grow older. I realize that. I have talked with several of our men, and we feel that there should be another award, perhaps a degree, to recognize outstanding leadership in DeMolay. "It is odd," he continued, "that you should bring this up at this particular time. Do you remember in the early days, about 1920, some of you fellows were selected to help with the classes of new members and to assist me, to identify you as leaders. You wore yellow caps at all the meetings." "Of course I remember. Gorman McBride and all the rest were proud of those caps. They were like the caps worn by the Scottish Rite members, only different in color." Dad smiled. "And what did we call you? Do you remember the name that went with the cap?" "Yes, it was Chevalier." The degree of Chevalier was approved on April 11th, 1936. The honor was conferred upon members of the Order of DeMolay who had performed unusual and meritorious service in behalf of the Order, who had attained the age of 18 years later changed to 17 years, and who had been members of a chapter for at least 2 years. No one was to apply for this distinction. The unanimous vote of the Grand Council in regular session was required to elect a nominee to receive the degree of Chevalier. This was the first ritual written without Frank Marshall. Frank Land had given help and guidance in all ritual services that had been composed before. Now he accepted the challenge of writing a ritual for the presentation of this new degree that he referred to as the highest award for distinguished DeMolay service. Within the gift of the Grand Council, only one other award, the Legion of Honor, for outstanding leadership and service to humanity, he wrote, outranks this distinction. The ritual, much shorter than the Legion of Honor ceremony, contains a deeper religious tone. For the first time in DeMolay ritual, a major portion of Scripture was included. Land was a master of the Bible. He lived by it and read it again and again during his morning periods of contemplation and prayer. He included the inspiring words of David, who sang of the security of the godly in the 91st chapter of the Psalms. To this belief in God, he added, that sacred thing called home, and that patriotism which, while making known to every man his rights, still makes him mindful of the rights of every other man. It was a dramatic presentation of the threefold purpose he had always associated with DeMolay: love of God, love of home, and love of country. The obligation, short, brief, and full of meaning for the years that were to come, concluded with a line that contained the theme of the degree. I furthermore promise and vow that I will, each day hereafter, strive to be a better man than I have ever been before. So help me God. The geometric figure of the triangle had long been a part of DeMolay, and now, in this degree, the figure of the circle was introduced, not only in the ring placed on the third finger of the left hand, but as the Grand Commander in the drama of the ceremony says, My brothers, you will kneel forming a circle around me. With the designates kneeling, the prayer was given, and the cordon and medallion of the Chevalier was placed about the neck and shoulders as each young man rose to a standing position. The circle of comradeship became a traditional part of many services of rededication. High in the Rockies of Colorado, within the shadow of Long's Peak, or in a clearing of the tall pines of the Smokies of North Carolina, or in the crater of the sand dunes of Asilomar, California, the boys of leadership camps were to gather at night, forming a huge circle about a campfire of light. There they would turn outward so that they could see only the night, the stars, and the world in which they were alone on the threshold of their adventure of life. Only the stillness, and yet like the words of Caruth, was the pull of the unknown. Like tides on a crescent sea beach, when the moon is new and thin, and to our hearts' high yearnings come welling and surging in. Come from the mystic ocean, come welling and surging in, whose rim no foot has trod. Some of us call it dedication, others call it God. Then, as they turned to face the light of the fire, they found the presence of their companions. They were not alone. Shoulder to shoulder they stood with others who would help through all the years, and there was sufficient light in the darkness to illuminate their way. A curious happening gave doubt as to who was the first Chevalier. Land had just finished the writing of his ritual when he suddenly decided that 2 of the young men of the headquarters staff should receive the obligation. He called John McKibben and Jack Rennick to come to his office. Both were in the basement of the building, and like the story of St. John, so they ran both together, and the other did outrun Peter and came first. John did outrun Jack, and became the first to receive the obligation of a Chevalier, and the first listed in the formal vestiture. But Jack insisted that each entered the study of Dad at almost the same time, give or take a second. In the first public presentation in the Little Theater of the Municipal Auditorium in Kansas City on June 2, 1937, Land assumed the position of Grand Commander, assisted by members of the Legion of Honor. Golden yellow robes were worn, and the cordons presented were of the same color, with a medallion depicting Jacques DeMolay, the martyr. The name Chevalier was well chosen. Knighthood and chivalry always held a central position in DeMolay, and the French translation of the English word knight is chevalier. Both words come from a common source meaning on horseback, suggesting that the knight or chevalier rode a horse into battle instead of fighting on foot as a common soldier of the ranks. Indeed, in the game of chess, the knight is represented as a horse that has great mobility and can turn in midair, while the pawn as a foot soldier can only plod forward in a fixed straight line. The word horse in English comes from the word cheval in French. The title of chevalier is often mentioned in the Crusade stories, especially in accounts of the First Crusade, which was largely a French enterprise. This crusade was summoned by Pope Urban II in the late years of the 11th century as he preached in France with such fitting words that the multitude shouted, "God wills it." There were great names: Raymond, Godfrey, Bohemond, Philip I, and Tancred of Hauteville described as a typical chevalier being handsome, fearless, gallant, generous, loving glory and wealth, and universally admired for his courage. There is a description of the ceremony of knighting found in an ancient tome that relates, "He that is to be made a knight is stricken by the prince with a sword drawn upon his back or shoulder, the prince saying, 'Sois chevalier.' When the knight rises, the prince saith, 'Avancez.'" Land must have had this in mind when he concluded the ceremony of the evening by saying, "To each of you who has been honored by the order of DeMolay by receiving the degree of chevalier, I say, arise, chevalier, and advance ever forward from this hour." The affectionate, characterizing laurel of Dad, given to him by his boys, was always regarded by Frank Land as a mark of honor. He was called Dad by the members of DeMolay and by his friends of his own age or older. He was also proud to be known as the Grand Scribe and Secretary General, but during the years of the mid-1930s, he found increasing value in being referred to in introductions and printed material as Founder. Not that it denoted personal gratification, but because it carried the ringing connotation of one who had laid a foundation for youth, one who had established and erected the edifice of DeMolay, and who had created a means of keeping alive the great ideals of civilized mankind. In this spirit, and to give expression, in a tangible way, to those who had befriended him, he designed and had the jewel fabricated to be known as the Founder's Cross. It was an award of embracing meaning. A bar at the top held the word "Loyalty" in raised letters. Suspended by a white ribbon was a four-stemmed Maltese cross in bronze. In the center, a DeMolay emblem was encircled by a laurel leaf with green inlaid enamel. On the reverse side of the cross was engraved the name of the recipient and the personal message, "In grateful appreciation from Frank S. Land, Founder." The jewel was to be worn over the heart. This designation was not a Grand Council honor. Frank Land alone had the privilege of conferring it as a distinct, personal recognition given to those whom he desired to honor for their personal, consistent, and conspicuous loyalty to him. The Founder's Cross was given only during his lifetime. In the period from 1937 to 1959, he presented the medal to 135 persons. Only a few received the Founder's Cross, but thousands of young men came under the influence of the Founders' Conferences held during the summers of 1936, 1938, and 1958 in the Municipal Auditorium of Kansas City. Each conference had its own distinctive quality, but all held a common denominator under the basic theme of youth and tomorrow. The founder wrote in the preface of the programs, "This meeting is to be a feast of inspiration dedicated to the DeMolay of the future, and no similar opportunity has been given the youth of this generation to understand the new world of human endeavor, the new frontiers of opportunity, the amazing future seen by scientific researches, the new fields of social usefulness, the kind of a world they're going to live in." They were stimulating youth gatherings in a transitional age seeking answers, and in the Founders' Conferences, Youth found answers from a man who understood them and was aware of the seething world demanding adjustment to age-old values. A chapel service greeted each day of a conference. The order of service had been written by Land to convey the full impact of a universal religious belief presented in such form and phraseology as to be acceptable and to inspire each boy in harmony with his religious background. A typical responsive invocation read, O omnipresent God, if we are accustomed to seeking Thee in our daily lives at home and abroad, then are we witnesses to the truth that Thou dost reveal ourselves in our varied experiences. And so we come to this place to seek Thee together as friends and comrades, bearing the name of one who sought Thee and was faithful to Thee unto death, even the flaming death at the stake. We have sought Thee in the pages of Thy holy writ, and they have spoken to us. We have sought Thee in the majesty and mystery of all Thy creation, and in it we feel Thy presence. We have sought Thee in the human lives lifted by high purposes, unselfish aspirations, and sacrificial love. And we have seen Thee shining through the beauty of their lives. O God, speak to us now in the experience of this hour as we seek to enter into fellowship with Thee. Men known nationally as religious leaders were invited to conduct the services. The Reverend Charles W. Gilkey, Dean of the University of Chicago Chapel. The Reverend Ralph W. Sockman, pastor of the National Radio Pulpit. The Very Reverend Francis Eric Bloy, Dean of St. Paul's Episcopal Cathedral, Los Angeles, and to show his confidence in a young man's future, Dad invited Reverend Herbert E. Duncan, then the pastor of the Longview Chapel of Lee Summit, Missouri, and a past master counselor of Mother Chapter, to assist in chapel services. Remarkable music for the chapel services, the investitures, and meetings became a tradition. One conference heard the hundreds of voices of the Michigan State DeMolay Chorus under the direction of Harold F. Koch, who was to become executive officer of the state of Michigan, and the 40-voiced Menzingers, also organized by Harold F. Koch. The First Founders Conference heard the Messiah Choir of the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints of Independence, Missouri, assisted by P. Hans Floth and his symphony orchestra. During this conference of the first Grand Preceptory of the DeMolay Legion of Honor was held, and this honor conferred upon Walt Disney, who then made the first public speech of his career. Men who came to address the meetings furnished the source of promise of the present and the new frontiers of the years to come. They met in open discussion after their major address to talk with the boys, to guide, and to challenge. They were titans in their fields of business, science, law, and government. Land took great personal pride in their acceptance of this invitation to take part in the Founders' Conferences. They were men such as Ellis Manning, physicist and director of the General Electric Science Forum broadcasts, speaking on new frontiers in electricity. Dr. William A. Ganfield, president of Carroll College, Wisconsin, whose address was The World I Shall Never See. Dr. James K. Hunt, technical advisor, E.I. DuPont de Nemours and Company, whose subject was New Frontiers in Chemistry. Cameron Beck, director of the New York Stock Exchange Institute, speaking on New Frontiers in Leadership. C.R. Barrymore, official photographer, American Olympic Games, who illustrated his talk with slides under the title, With American Athletes at the Berlin Olympics. Wheeler McMillan, editorial director, The Country Home, president of the National Farm Chemergic Council, speaking on the subject New Founders in Chemergy. W. H. Drain Lester, assistant to J. Edgar Hoover, and inspector, Federal Bureau of Investigation, whose topic was New Frontiers in Law Observance. Dr. Warren F. Draper, first assistant United States Surgeon General, speaking on New Frontiers in Medicine and Public Health. Hendrick H. Middle, who came as a representative of the General Electric Company to show the spectacular House of Magic that had been a feature of the Century of Progress exhibition. Each Founders Conference closed with a banquet and a service rededication led by the founder of DeMolay. Each one present stood and with the hush of sincerity and the consecration of Dad Land, placed his hand over his heart, spoke his name, and then repeated the words to once again dedicate himself to all the ideals and vows he had taken at a DeMolay altar. Then, as the tables were removed and the huge arena of the auditorium was cleared, the grand ball was held. Printed as a part of the conference booklet of information was this paragraph. The special guests of the delegates of the grand ball are some 500 of the flower of Kansas City's young womanhood. They are the sisters and friends of DeMolays, invited from the finest families of the city to add to your enjoyment of the evening. Though individual introductions are impossible on an occasion of this sort, each one of your guests are to be thought of and treated with all the courtesies which a DeMolay shows the girlfriends and dates of any brother DeMolay. Lewis Gordon Lower was the man most sought after from all the prominent men present for the first and second Founders Conferences. The boys wanted to meet him and to go home saying, "I shook the hands of Louis Lower, the first DeMolay." To them he personified all the order represented in personality, appearance, ability, and dedication. He was a legend in his own time and had been looked up to, admired, and respected since DeMolay first took form. Chapter members could talk to Louis when they were reluctant to talk to those in authority of the organization of DeMolay, and found him ever ready to listen and take positive action if such action was needed. And because of his influence, the generation gap that could have existed never came into being. Many of his friends looked upon him as the crown prince, the heir apparent of DeMolay, who would in the far future be the successor of Dad Land. With all the acclaim heaped upon him, he should have been the most conceited of men. But he was not. There was a humility about him that concealed what some regarded as a feeling of inferiority. Calm and outwardly composed, he gave leadership to DeMolay, remained the athlete, and fought within himself to bridle a temper and to refrain from what Emerson referred to as the words that tremble on the tongue in moments of irritation or wounded pride. Essentially, he was an idealist, but he was also a realist whose sense of reality had been tempered on the anvil of the Depression. He did not live in an ivory tower, withdrawn from the action and passion of the time, but took part in the stirring events whirling about him. When a campaign to clean up the political machine in Kansas City was launched by Rabbi Samuel S. Mayersburg, Lewis asked for a leave of absence from DeMolay and joined wholeheartedly in the effort to bring good government to the city. The political fight he entered was vicious. Kansas City had voted in 1924 for a charter form of government. It was a superb instrument of government. It established the city manager form of administration with a mayor and council. It abolished party emblems, created civic service both by letter and spirit, forbade political activity on the part of city employees, and otherwise guarantees for public protection. The citizens were delighted over the fact that they had abolished the old federal councilmanic form of city government, which had proved to be expensive and inefficient, with the opportunity of control through ward heelers, political bosses, political machines, and gangsters. The people, confident that the powers of the charter would protect them, relaxed their vigilance. As a consequence, their high hopes were soon crushed under the ruthless heel of selfish politicians. The members of the council were soon made to feel that they owed their election to the political boss, Thomas J. Pendergast, who had inherited his political kingdom from his uncle and in the early days had been a saloon keeper. Under his advice, they selected Henry F. McElroy as city manager, a man without training for the huge and involved tasks confronting an administration of a complex city. But he was an intimate friend of Tom Pendergast. Henry McElroy, as the new city manager, announced that the people had given him a mandate, and the days of mismanagement of the city began. The local paper wrote that the powerful political force of the administration had squandered public funds to perpetuate its own patronage and had allowed commercialized vice. which earned Kansas City a worldwide reputation for lawlessness and criminal activity. But there were those who strongly supported the machine and pointed to the building of new City Hall, the courthouse, and municipal auditorium as example of the good created. The campaign Louis Lower faced was hard fought, with a failure in the first attempt to elect a mayor. In the spring of 1940, however, thousands of volunteer citizens, using as their symbol a broom to sweep City Hall, finally were able to defeat the Pendergast forces. They elected a nonpartisan city council headed by John B. Gage as mayor. This council selected L.P. Cockingham as city manager. One of his first acts in this capacity was to employ Louis G. Lower as manager of the municipal auditorium. Lower's friendly personality, his wide circle of friends, his ability to organize and manage made him ideal for the appointment. He served well for over 2 years, and then on Sunday, July 18, 1943, the Kansas City Star carried the headline, "Kills Louis G. Lower." The first DeMolay had been murdered in the early morning hours by Clyde O. Sellars, a guard employed as a special officer for the Aircraft Accessories Corporation, Fairfax Airport, who was attempting to direct traffic between two loading islands just east of the Union Station in Kansas City. Louis had spent the day before, a Saturday, in New York, securing attractions for the coming year of activities planned for the auditorium. Arriving home late in the evening, he had then driven to the auditorium and was busy there until well after midnight. He then drove south on Main Street to the Union Station, where he started to drive between the two loading islands, a practice permitted under city ordinances. Sellars, in uniform, and according to witnesses, under the influence of liquor, attempted to flag Lower to the right side of the West Island as he treated other motorists. Lower stopped his car, challenged Sellars' right to direct traffic, and asked to see his badge number. The two men argued. Lower put out his hand several times toward the left breast of Sellars to inspect the badge, but his hand was knocked down each time. Sellars then held his left arm straight out as if to ward off the approach of Lower, and with his right hand pulled his revolver from a holster. Holding it against Lower's chest, he deliberately shot. Louis Lower died 15 minutes later. Clyde Sellars, a man of 49 years, did not show a great remorse. His statement was, "It's just my luck it had to be some big shot. I'm sorry that I shot the man. I didn't know him, but it's too bad for me that it wasn't some little fellow." He was sentenced in the court of Judge Ben Turte on December 6, 1943, to 15 years in prison after pleading guilty to the slaying. He was paroled after serving only 3 years of his sentence. More than 800 persons attended the funeral services on July 20th, 1943, conducted by the Reverend Herbert E. Duncan. In the service, Mr. Duncan said, "The wholly unnecessary death of Louis Lower has shocked all of us who knew him, as well as every person who heard of or ever read about him. In this day of war, we are accustomed to the loss of life, but this poignant tragedy stunned each of us beyond description. His death is a loss to the city because, as director of the municipal auditorium, he represented the highest type of public service we have in our city. But, in addition, his death is a loss to the state and the nation. He had a bright future before him as a citizen, a public official, and a community leader. He always was the exemplification of fearlessness in opposing injustice and intolerance. He opposed it wherever he found it. Perhaps the finest thing that can be said of Louis Lower," the minister added, "is that every one of you here is able to say, 'I knew him as a friend,' that he was to everyone." The Legion of Honor conducted services for him at the cemetery using the memorial service of the DeMolay ritual. Walter C. Ploser, then representative in Congress from St. Louis and a lifetime friend, delivered a brief eulogy stressing Lower's life and the part he had taken in the formation of DeMolay. Louis Lower's death was a deep loss to DeMolay, especially to Frank Land, who regarded him as a son. He said, "Louis Lower was not only the first DeMolay in the world, but he was the first member of the Legion of Honor. He was a symbol to millions of young men of the ideals and teaching of our order. He wore the mantle of this stewardship with dignity and grace. He never forgot the responsibility that was his. The ethics of leadership taught him in DeMolay flowered in countless fields of endeavor. He was a man of ideals. He kept them to himself until the hour of fulfillment arrived. Some were the dreams of boyhood when he was an active DeMolay from which he never departed. He loved God, his home, and country. He was a knight-errant in his daily life, although he would never admit it, but it was there. Louis Lower today becomes a legend. He will forever be leading the mystical vanguard of youth. Death came with the morning sun shining upon his brow." Reference had been made in Lower's funeral to the war years which had descended upon the nation. Once again, a time had come when the pressure of outside events was to bring a decline to the order of DeMolay. Activities and economic pinch came as financial and emotional drain was placed upon the nation with federal controls, rationing, and the determination to win the war at all costs. Membership dropped to low levels as men and boys left the chapters to serve in the armed forces of the nation. Letters came to Dadland from Corregidor, Alaska, the foxholes of Bataan, the flight decks of the mighty ships of the Atlantic and Pacific, and wherever his boys were serving. He wrote countless letters in reply. Most difficult were the letters of sympathy sent to parents when he learned that a son had given his life for his country. The war brought to the DeMolay movement economic hazards, added vision, and a great strengthening of purpose. Land said, "The question of economic stability is of the utmost importance, but the greatest consideration must be the basic character of our present and future program." In his report to the Grand Council on March 9, 1942, in Louisville, Kentucky, he included this reference to the war. DeMolay is experiencing its first war, and thousands of our active and alumni members are already receiving their first baptism of fire. During the past months, several hundred advisors have volunteered or have been drafted for military services. Many of the chapters whose advisors have so resigned have been experiencing difficulty. The Order of DeMolay had its birth in the close of World War I. As pioneers, we have blazed our trail through trial and error. Oftentimes, our mistakes have proved costly, but the shuttle of experience has woven a pattern upon our escutcheon that has called to its colors more than 1.5 million of the youth of the world. We have taken pride during peaceful pursuits in the worthwhile evidences of DeMolay teaching. Now we meet the supreme tests of seeing how well our teachings stand the onslaught of treacherous warfare influences. Our task is to develop the latent powers within a young man that he will go forth from our midst fortified as well as sustained with unfaltering moral standards, habits of character, ideals of citizenship and democracy that will help him budge and meet every emergency that he is called upon to face, whether it be in secret or before the eyes of the world. We need the wise counsel and best thought of all. Our present duties are tremendous. I bring to you no stereotyped message and report of peaceful days ahead. For us there remains the scaling of innumerable peaks of high endeavor, dogged determination, ceaseless effort, and a supreme faith in the ultimate victory of our arms. Ceaseless effort had always been the untiring policy of Dad Land to provide an order that would reach out to his boys. He had been aware of the increased knowledge of the younger boy and had lowered the age level by taking those less than the original 16 years into membership. But now the older men became paramount in his thinking. While the World War was going on, there had been no problem because most of these older chaps were in the armed services. Now, a change was taking place. The boy who left high school last year and the year before was older. The interests in high school age activities dimmed, and for this older boy of DeMolay, a vision of new frontiers beckoned. Land turned to the leadership of the order with the question, how are we going to sustain this older lad's high enthusiasm for DeMolay unless we have a supplementary program to hold him? Other youth movements projected programs for the older members in keeping with the general theme of their organizations. DeMolay now created a program based on knighthood, such as it might have been in the later days of chivalry, when the rules and precedent of former times had been revised to give the grandeur of refinement and the rich beauty of the ceremony. The touch of fire on a lance in the early morning sunlight was gone, lost in history. The young men Frank wanted to interest had seen the flash of fire of modern weapons on the battle lines of the world and the mushroom cloud of the atomic bomb. Still, the spirit of chivalry had its appeal. Knights and armor and swords were only symbolic to the men of the new post-war age, in representing the noblest precepts of an ancient code that came from earlier ages of discipline, self-control, and outward or inward refinement. Amid towering walls of Tudor stone softened by the flags of many a battle, the tragedies and the mistakes of knighthood were forgotten, as the knightly ages brought the glory of having formulated a code of honor. A code so strong and respected that Charlemagne girded his son, Charles the Pious, with sword, shield, and lance, and Charles the Pious girded his son in like manner when his son arrived at manhood. All of this pageantry was written into a new ritual by Dad Land, the master of the legend, the romance, and the idealism of the ages of chivalry. In 1948, the Grand Council created a new working organization, using the new ritual within the framework of a chapter set up for the older young men. It was an auxiliary body known in DeMolay parlance and for the sake of brevity as the Order of Knighthood, but whose official name was the Chivalric Knights of the Holy Order of the Fellow Soldiers of Jacques DeMolay. Each such auxiliary body to a chapter of the Order of DeMolay was known as a priory and bore the same name as the chapter to which it was attached. Dad Land explained, for the purpose of illustration, should the DeMolay chapter be known as Oakwood chapter, then the priories would be Oakwood Priory of the Oakwood chapter, Order of DeMolay. The creation of a priory will in no measure affect the operation of a DeMolay chapter. DeMolay's receiving the Order of Knighthood will prove more active in chapter affairs than heretofore. It is not an honorary degree or award. It is a working body geared to activities that older boys want and like. During the first year of its inception, 51 chapters requested letters for the formation of priories. The boys, 18 years and older, found increased incentive to participate in DeMolay. They responded to the ritual that consisted of an opening ceremony, a ceremony of investiture, and an installation service. The closing prayer of installation was the prayer of a knight of any or all ages. Almighty God, we approach thy heavenly throne with that humility which is the true shield of all knights. Bless our good intentions and guide us in all our undertakings. Inspire our minds with knightly thoughts and our hearts with chivalrous virtues. Bless the cause in which we labor, and if it be thy will, may this order become a power for good in all the world. Amen.